Imagine being completely blind, but still charging into one of the most brutal battles of the Middle Ages. Now imagine doing this at age 50, knowing full well you might not survive. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of John of Luxembourg, King of Bohemia, a man history remembers as John the Blind. In 1346, at the Battle of Crécy, a sightless king tied his horse to those of his knights and rode directly into the chaos of medieval warfare. It was an act so audacious, so defiant of every reasonable instinct, that it became legendary across Europe. But this final, fatal charge was just the culmination of a life that reads like an adventure novel. Today, we're diving into the remarkable story of a king who embodied the ideals of medieval chivalry, even when those ideals led him to his doom. Early life and the prize of Bohemia. John was born in 1296 into one of medieval Europe's most ambitious families. His father was Henry VII of Luxembourg, who would become Holy Roman Emperor. Think of the Holy Roman Empire as a sprawling, complex political entity covering much of Central Europe. It wasn't really Roman, and it wasn't always particularly holy, but it was definitely an empire, or at least tried to be. The emperor was elected by powerful princes, and the position brought immense prestige, if not always real power. The Luxembourg family, despite their grand name, controlled a relatively small territory. They were skilled at punching above their weight through strategic marriages and alliances. And in 1310, when John was just 14 years old, his family hit the jackpot. The Kingdom of Bohemia, roughly corresponding to the modern Czech Republic, was one of the wealthiest regions in Europe. It had silver mines, a strategic position in Central Europe, and the capital city of Prague was already becoming a major center of culture and commerce. When the previous ruling dynasty died out, a power vacuum emerged. Henry VII, seeing an opportunity, arranged for his teenage son John to marry Elizabeth, the sister of the last Bohemian king. At 14, John became King of Bohemia. It sounds glamorous, but the reality was messy. Bohemia was in chaos. The nobility was divided into factions. The kingdom's finances were in ruins. The treasury had been plundered, and John, who had grown up in the courts of France and Luxembourg, didn't even speak Czech. He was a foreigner imposed on a reluctant kingdom. Most young rulers might have been overwhelmed, but John had inherited his family's ambition. He also had something else, an insatiable appetite for adventure and military glory. Throughout his reign, John would struggle with the boring parts of kingship, the administration and diplomacy, but he excelled at the exciting parts: warfare, tournaments, and grand political schemes. The Adventurer King. To understand John, you need to understand the culture of medieval chivalry. Knights weren't just warriors. They belonged to an entire social system built around ideals of honor, courage, and martial prowess. Tournaments, where knights fought in mock combat, were the sporting events of the era. Military campaigns weren't just about gaining territory. They were opportunities to prove your worth and win glory. John threw himself into this world with reckless enthusiasm. He was constantly involved in military campaigns, often far from Bohemia. He fought in Italy, supporting various factions in the endless conflicts there. He campaigned in Poland and Lithuania, supposedly bringing Christianity to pagan lands, but really seeking adventure and plunder. He intervened in disputes in Germany, France, and the Low Countries. His subjects in Bohemia must have wondered if they actually had a king. John was rarely home. He was constantly traveling, fighting, negotiating, attending tournaments. His court moved with him. When he was in Bohemia, he often couldn't wait to leave again. The administrative work of running a kingdom bored him. He left that to his advisors and officials, not always wisely. But here's the thing: his contemporaries loved him. Other nobles and knights saw him as the perfect embodiment of chivalric ideals. He was generous, brave, and always ready for a fight. He threw lavish feasts and tournaments. He patronized poets and musicians. His court became known for its culture and sophistication, blending German, French, and Czech influences. He also genuinely expanded Bohemian power. Through a combination of warfare, strategic marriages, and political maneuvering, he acquired significant territories. He gained control of parts of Silesia, Upper Lusatia, and other regions. He made Bohemia a major player in Central European politics. His son, who would become Charles IV, would eventually become Holy Roman Emperor, partly because of the foundation John built. The darkness descends. But John's relentless campaigning came at a cost. Around 1337, when he was in his early 40s, he began to lose his sight. The exact cause isn't certain. Medieval sources suggest various explanations, but modern historians think it might have been ophthalmia, an infection possibly contracted during his campaigns, or perhaps a progressive condition like glaucoma or cataracts. For most people, going blind would mean retirement. For a medieval king whose entire identity was built around military prowess and physical courage, it should have meant the end of an active life. John's response? He simply refused to stop. Think about what this means. Medieval warfare was brutal and chaotic. Battles were fought hand-to-hand with swords, axes, and lances. Knights on horseback crashed into formations of infantry. The noise would have been overwhelming, the confusion total. Now imagine experiencing this without sight. John adapted. He couldn't lead armies in the field as he once had, but he could still fight. He would have knights describe the battlefield to him. He would have them guide his horse, and he continued to participate in combat, relying on his experience, his instincts, and the loyalty of his men. His contemporaries were awed. Here was a man who embodied the chivalric ideal so completely that not even blindness could stop him. To medieval thinkers, this showed incredible virtue. Physical disability was often seen as divine punishment or a sign of moral weakness, but John's continued valor challenged these prejudices. He became known throughout Europe as John the Blind, but the nickname was more admiring than pitying. His family and advisors probably worried constantly. His son Charles, who was acting as regent in Bohemia, must have begged him to be more careful. But John was who he was. The pursuit of glory and honor wasn't something he could abandon just because he couldn't see. The final charge. This brings us to August 26th, 1346, and the Battle of Crécy. To understand this battle, you need to know about the 100 Years' War, the long conflict between England and France over territorial claims and succession rights. The English King Edward III had invaded France with a relatively small army. The French King Philip VI gathered a much larger force to confront him. John had no direct stake in this conflict. Bohemia was far from France. But Philip VI was an ally, and more importantly, this was a chance for glory. John, now 50 years old and completely blind, brought a contingent of Bohemian knights to fight for France. The Battle of Crécy was a disaster for the French. The English had taken up a defensive position on a hillside. They had a secret weapon, massed formations of longbowmen. Medieval people understood archery, but English longbows were something special. They had incredible range and power, and English archers could fire rapidly and accurately. The French knights, including John and his men, charged repeatedly at the English position. Each time they were torn apart by arrow storms. Thousands of arrows darkened the sky. Knights and horses fell in heaps. The ground became slippery with blood. It was a slaughter. John couldn't see any of this, but he could hear it. The screams of men and horses, the whistling of arrows, the clash of steel, and he demanded to be taken into the fight. According to the chronicles, John ordered his knights to tie their horses' reins to his, forming a small group that would stay together no matter what. Then he commanded them to lead him forward into the English lines so that he could strike a blow with his sword. Think about this decision. John had to know this was likely suicide. The battle was clearly going badly. Any rational person would have retreated. But John's entire life had been built on the ideals of chivalry. Courage, honor, loyalty to your allies. To retreat would be to betray everything he believed in. The small group of knights charged. They actually penetrated deep into the English lines before they were overwhelmed. John fought blindly, swinging his sword, until he and his knights were cut down. When the battle ended, the English found John's body still tied to the horses of his dead companions. Legacy. The English were moved by John's courage. King Edward III's son, known as the Black Prince, supposedly adopted John's motto, Ich dien, meaning I serve, and incorporated John's ostrich feather crest into his own heraldry. This symbol still appears on the Prince of Wales's coat of arms today. Whether this story is entirely accurate is debated by historians, but the fact that it became legend tells you something about John's impact. John's death at Crécy became one of the most famous examples of medieval chivalry. Poets and chroniclers wrote about it for centuries. Here was a man who embodied the knightly virtues so completely that not even blindness and certain death could make him abandon his code of honor. But we should also see John's story with clear eyes. His obsessive pursuit of glory was expensive. It often left Bohemia poorly governed. His campaigns sometimes caused suffering for ordinary people who just wanted peace. His death at Crécy, while heroic by medieval standards, was arguably wasteful. Bohemia lost its king in a foreign battle that had nothing to do with its interests. Yet his son, Charles IV, who had been carefully educated and prepared for kingship, would use the foundation John built. Charles would become one of the greatest Holy Roman emperors, making Prague a major European capital and the cultural center of the empire. In that sense, John's chaotic, adventurous reign set the stage for greater things. Closing. John the Blind represents something essential about the medieval worldview. In an age where life was often short and brutal, where death could come from disease, war, or accident at any moment, people like John chose to live by a code that valued honor and courage above safety or even survival. To modern sensibilities, his final charge seems foolish, even suicidal. But to understand medieval culture, we need to appreciate that John's contemporaries saw it differently. They saw a man who remained true to his principles even when it cost him everything. Whether we admire John or see him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of romantic ideals, we can't deny that he lived and died in a way that people remembered. 678 years later, we're still talking about the blind king who rode into battle one last time. That perhaps is the legacy he wanted. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into medieval history, please like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what other historical figures you'd like to hear about. Until next time, keep exploring history.